Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Tom Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Terminal Philosophy to discuss the Euthyphro dilemma of music, film, and writing. Tim, so what on earth is the Euthyphro dilemma of writing, film, and music?
The Euthyphro dilemma is an ancient Greek thing come up by Socrates and Plato in one of their dialogues, and asked the question, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? You could try to argue this is a false dilemma, and that's one of the ways out of this situation here. And in the monotheistic context, you just replace gods with God. And let's think, if we want to think about culture, art, films, music, and so forth here, is beautiful art or good art something which has some sort of, and we'll try to atheize it too, to some extent if we want to, although you could keep the theistic content in it if you too. Is good art, is there some independent standard of objective art, or is good art merely that which the elites of a given time and day say is good art? You could also include countercultural elites here. I think people, there are, you can find them here. So for example, this is a quick dirty example here. Rotten Tomatoes, the New York Times have praised the Netflix series on Fauci. I think it's a Netflix series on Fauci. Now, I don't think this is going to stand up to time as being a great series, whether or not you think all the particularities of the of what happened in the last 3 years now is the case or isn't the case. It's probably just relatively bland storytelling in that sense here. So one question you could ask is the historical question. One test of what is good art is just say, was the art good at the time when it was made, and is the art good now? One of the things which I think conservatives, and Thaddeus Russell at times is very good at pointing this out, is that in the past, the crass art, the popular art, like the five and dime things during the 1800s were very popular here. So this would be the fast food of the 1800s here to the literary. Now again, literary rates differed over time, of course, but the kind of crass art, like the five and dimes, which was sort of like proto-erotica almost of the day here. So you can find crass art in the past here. So it's not necessarily a new phenomena. And the art that we associate with the past, like the quote-unquote good art, may not have been as popular at the time. There's a trope about certain artists being poor, dying poor here, and having their works liked later on. Whether that's empirically true of all artists is a good question, but there's enough examples you can point to where you could easily say that is the case. On a personal level, because I'm part of society, I'm an individual too, there are art that I like, music, films, books, and stuff, that not everyone else likes, in particularly elites like, and in particularly countercultural elites here. So this is a fairly elementary point, but there's some disagreement about what counts as good art. Some people like G.K. Chesterton. Some people don't like G.K. Chesterton. I recently read the book, The Man Who Was Thursday, and I really loved it. Thought it was 10 out of 10. I tried to read another piece of G.K. Chesterton because I liked that one. I thought it was terrible, and I couldn't get through the first few chapters here. I like Orwell a lot. Some people who I also respect don't think he is as good as people say he is, for example. And when the things comes to music and films, the same things at play. I probably like music which is some certain amount of music which is considered trashy by certain people. Adorno, Roger Scruton might say that certain types of music I like is, we did an episode of Right Ruminations on music maybe 2 years ago now, or even 3 years ago now. So my first question here, is good art merely a matter of taste, which has lots of variety? Because you could say, well, some people like chicken, other people like fish. There could be reasons that fish is good, there could be reasons that chicken is good. Some like it, and you can say, well, it's the cooking method. Some like it fried, some people like it seared. Now, obviously, straight up poison isn't good art, isn't good. Unless maybe you desire self-destruction. So maybe poisonous fish is good fish. So TP here, you do agree that in a sense, what counts as good art varies in times, places, and different people within the places here. So what do you make about the Euthyphro dilemma of art? Do you think it's a first of all a valid analogy, and is good art a mere the one view I have of this is just say, well, it's just tastes. TP, thanks for being on here.
Hey there. Yeah, well, thanks for having me back as always. I will just say first of all that superimposing the Euthyphro dilemma over art is very interesting. Uh, you know, you might get dinged or needlessly nitpicked by other people who read philosophy that's an unnecessary or an inappropriate formula to analyze art and aesthetics and things like that. But I think it's a totally valid question, just given the stage in history that we're at. But yeah, I absolutely agree that much of what makes good art is highly dependent on taste and one's own background and things like that. Um, of course, a lot of conversations like this that involve, especially taste in music in the modern day, are related around, the discussion of pop music and whether pop music is really good or if it's all bad or if there's some sort of gray area there. And I tend to think that there's definitely some gray area. But I will say that while it's not objectively true that Mozart and Bach and uh, Wagner and plenty of other composers and things like that, which most people consider to be great art, great music, um, which and I fall in that camp as well. Um, there is of course the second category of where art is just highly contingent on one's own culture, things like that, like hip hop, metal, uh, synthwave, video game soundtracks, what have you. So, yeah, and again, this is not to appeal towards relativism because obviously that's something I'm ultimately not a subscriber of. But yeah, it is absolutely highly dependent on one's own taste. And what you were saying earlier about, I think you had mentioned it was either the New York Times or maybe it was like Rotten Tomatoes with giving Fauci praise on his own. I think you mentioned it was an autobiography. Yeah, clearly there's some trickery here going on, which is that there is what is deemed publicly acceptable is really just publicly acceptable, or it's only praised by uh, many of today's cultural and political and social leaders, and that includes, the unappealing likes of people who run these like the E channel, like the Hollywood archetypes, people who've never, you know, maybe have never listened to, say, Pink Floyd or more universally, or maybe not universally, but widely popular bands. They may have never heard of those bands, but they certainly love Katy Perry and Lady Gaga and things like that. So, um, yeah, unfortunately, there is the phenomenon of, I guess you could say, I don't know, the cultural elite have a very fixed bandwidth on what should be played constantly, and this pop music, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, uh, insert your favorite comparison to those artists. They follow a very specific, simplistic formula, and these people don't even write their own music. Uh, their music is purchased by record labels, and those record labels purchase them from uh, industry tested and accepted songwriters who follow very similar formulas of song structure and melody and things like that. So yes, I think part of your question is addressing, uh, you know, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but what are we to make of the modern society's definition of good art, and then there's sort of, I guess you could say, the rest of us who actually have cast a very wide net in terms of musical and artistic interests, and there's definitely a wide gap there. And why there is a gap there is, I suppose that's what partially what we're addressing today, and I think it has to do with. It's really difficult to word it, but I think it has something to do with like very, what business or record label people or artistic people will deem is just commercially, or what will be commercially successful, whereas they don't want to take risks on things that are, I guess you could say, more unconventional, or perhaps a monetary risk. And say the artist who wrote the Blade Runner soundtrack, Vangelis, is probably a much higher risk than getting behind someone like Britney Spears. So there you have it for my opening salvo.
I do think taste very much does play a part. I don't think that's avoidable. As you say, some people like fish, some people like steak and beef, etc. However, what I would say is there is generally a good way or a better way of cooking steak, and there is a better way of cooking fish. Now, I might recognize that this is actually a very good version of fish, but actually not like it as much as a well done steak. By well done, just for listeners, I don't mean well done. Okay, I'm not butchering it. I think what we need to do here is to recognize good versions of things. Now, then the question is, well, are there some versions of things which are inherently better than each other? That might be a more difficult question. But when it comes to things like pop music and things, as TP has pointed out, I think there are good versions of pop music that have a clean, strong melody, for instance, and it's generally well constructed. Now, is that as good as a symphony, for instance? Well, probably not, but doesn't mean that it's without value. So I think that's an appropriate distinction to make. On kind of a subjectivity and things, I think this is an interesting quote that Hildebrand quotes C.S. Lewis in to say. And Lewis is taking on the view that when we say something is a good art or whatever, what we're really doing is describing what our internal feelings are when we behold or listen to or watch some form of art. And so Lewis Tate has an interesting response to this. Now, not every form of relativism necessarily would have to hold this position, but I think it's an interesting quote. Even on their own view, or on any conceivable view, the man who says this is sublime cannot mean I have sublime feelings. Even if it were granted that such qualities of sublimity were simply and solely projected into things from our own emotions, yet the emotions which prompt the projection are the correlatives, and therefore almost the opposites of the qualities projected. The feelings which make a man call an object sublime are not sublime feelings, but feelings of veneration. If this is sublime is to be reduced at all to a statement about the speaker's feelings, the proper translation would be, I have humble feelings. If the view held by Gaius and Titius were consistently applied, it would lead to obvious absurdities. It would force them to maintain that you are contemptible means I have contemptible feelings, and in fact your feelings are contemptible means my feelings are contemptible. End quote. So going down sort of the subjectivist, emotivist line of, well, all there is no sort of object that you are actually describing, or you're really describing is your emotional response to it, is self-refuting. Another way of looking at sort of art and sort of beauty and things, which may be of interest, is Aquinas's view of beauty. Now, he says very easily that beauty is that which gives pleasure when seen, which is kind of, well, okay, tell me more. He highlights that it's located in intelligence of a sort of the rational mind. So to quote, this is since this is Aquinas, beauty consists in due proportion for the sense delight in duly proportions, as in what is after their own kind, because every sense is a sort of reason, just as it is in every cognitive faculty. Now, since knowledge is by assimilation and the similarity relates to form, beauty properly belongs to the nature of a formal cause. So going back to Aristotle, you mentioned before, formal, final, efficient cause. The idea of Aquinas is that, and this is what I think I was getting at to some extent with the various forms of music, is it's whatever is due to that particular form. And if it does that well, then it is in a certain sense beautiful. I mean, he develops as well his idea of beauty into sort of actuality, proportion, radiance, and integrity. Actuality, just it doesn't merely have things in potential. It actually the ground of beauty. It doesn't lack anything that it should have. Well, if it's perfectly beautiful, that is. Proportion, as mentioned, harmony. You can see that in architecture. The golden ratio is a good example of that. And sort of like radiance was just, for example, if you're like a human being has a particular color of skin, sort of radiant, it's in due to what it is to be a human, so a beautiful human. That's a very, very, very quick overview, but I think is an interesting way, and I do think the idea of formal cause is kind of relevant here, because it kind of treats it as a substantial whole, whereas sort of more relativistic theories can revolve just to that sort of emotivist position, which I think Lewis rightly criticizes.
The comments on Lewis were interesting. Now I'll move on to my second question, which I think will somewhat answer to some extent your most recent comments here, or at least attempt to. Is what is good considered manufactured via power by dominant culture? I think you're both aware of the Chomsky. Actually, I know if you discussed the Chomsky versus Foucault debate here. And one of the topics on that was justice. And of course, Foucault takes a very power-oriented view of justice. Justice is just basically what the power elite say is what powerful here. And that's actually one of what Socrates' interlocutors says, to go back to the Euthyphro dilemma. Pious. The second leg of this dilemma is pious really only good because the gods decree it has to be good. There's no independent stance. So if God, decreed that the not golden ratio was good, then people would then either think that or not think that. And if you didn't think that, then you weren't godly. So that'd be a quick way to out of it here. So then I guess you have to ask the question, like, who are the elites here? Because currently in this context, and I checked the tomato rating, and it has an 86 critic consensus. And some of the critics, for example, are CNN, Brian Lowry on that Fauci documentary writes, he's top critic and he gives it a full good rating. Same way with the Guardian, same way with the Sunday Times. They all give Fauci is a refreshing figure and a standard bearer for the truth. Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian, top critic. So these are the top critics of today, what they're saying of a film today. Will they think that in 60 years here? Now, if you think that in 60, this is sort of like goes into sort of Orwellian understandings of truth here, in that sense here. But as the people like Thaddeus Russell, I make no qualms that I think Thaddeus Russell, for all his faults, is quite an ingenious historian, and dare I say, somewhat philosopher, will make the point that about the origin of culture in the United States, that crass culture became the dominant culture at some point. Slaves, Jews, and all things. And you could get conspiratorial about that if you want to, and I think that's perfectly reasonable to do so if you really want to. We have what was considered low culture has become high culture, which is kind of weird. Barbecue is an example of that too, but also the Beatles. This is another example where you have like symphony orchestras playing the Beatles here. Now, I think Beatles are actually quite good. I thought that for when I was a kid as well. And I think they're still, well, maybe not the later ones, but you see elites saying they like Beatles. You see like the New York Symphony or something like the London Symphony playing the Beatles. So there's a sort of reverse signaling happening with elites here. I think the praising Fauci overly like a movie film like that. I usually use this as an example, but I think you could use that for other films too. The sort of obviously politically correct films. This is sort of like I guess the analogy would be like historically having religious films be praised here. But I do think that is a side effect that at certain times there are people who genuinely enjoyed watching that documentary. I don't deny that there are people who genuinely enjoyed watching that what I would call piece of propaganda, but and we did an episode on propaganda, but some people would say that's good art. Some people say the Soviet films, which I think there are good Soviet films. I think Metropolis, I watched that in German class. I thought it was actually quite interesting, well made here. That's good art, even though it's a sort of communist film. Although you could say it's an anarchist film too. But that'll be my second question. I should have answered somewhat what I would think. It's with the eternal philosophy. Is what is good is just power? Is that an appropriate thing? I think on some level, at some times, it has to be that case. But then, if you go all the way on this criticism, which is what the critics of Thaddeus Russell would say, you're just a relativist. And that's what Chomsky said to Foucault as well. You're just a relativist here. Then there is no real standard of justice, beauty out there. Then it is ultimately whatever the New York Times or the Catholic Church or whatever Orwell's agency, the Ministry of Truth, says is good. And that's what we just are sort of force-fed here. I mean, maybe there is no way out there. But on a practical, pragmatic level, I think there are many instances where it is quite clear that power just dictates what is good. TP?
Yeah, I think living in the modern age makes thinking about and listening to art from past eras. It makes it interesting. I'd say for one, I think the amount, the volume of art and music and aesthetics that's available to us now is much higher. I think that's that's self-evident than it was, say, during the days of Mozart and the great classical composers. So, in one sense, you could say, if you were to ask people what is good art back then, well, they don't have as much of a massive, sample or collection that we do, and so we are kind of left with a much more difficult task of declaring what is good and bad art. So, in those days, there was only there's only so much music and art to be available. So that small sample. That can make it either limiting, or it could make it a potentially like a gold standard for what art should be. And I think there can be arguments made both in favor and against that. Just as kind of an anecdote, in the 90s, I think he's retired now, but there's a really famous film critic named Leonard Maltin, who was a film critic and often had exclusive interviews with directors, actors, actresses, producers, things like that. And I think what made Leonard Maltin so popular was that his praise or dismissal of films was very accessible to the general public. He was not pretentious or condescending, and he wasn't constantly employing $400 adjectives and things like that. He was very very much on the same playing field in the sense that his work was understandable to the average person. So the reason why I bring him up is that you could say with your comments earlier about Thaddeus Russell's claim, which crass culture kind of became high culture, and there's sort of this there's this polarity shift, and I tend to agree with that 100%. I think that there really is now a much, much wider gap now here in the present day than there was, say, in the 1950s or 60s, with old school conservatives even poo-pooing things like blues or early rock and roll, the type of music that we'd hear on Back to the Future when Marty McFly goes to the 50s or something like that. So there may have been a gap then, but the gap now is so incredibly wide. And what I believe explains that gap is obviously the power structures that are in place, because there's something of a there's this sanitizing and xeroxing of pop music nowadays, and even art. When you go onto YouTube, and if you're just watching a YouTube show, that it could or a video, it could be about anything. It could be about the economics of China, and there will be a quaint British fellow reading a script, and then there will be like very like cheap and surface level crappy cartoons that are so bubbly and featureless and very reminiscent of modern capitalistic corporate art, where the legs and arms are just these massive blobs, and that doesn't reflect or seem to be based off of any previous art style. It's just so sanitized that it's not supposed to relate to anyone. It's just supposed to be this universal stand-in for happy people, and this is how, or even for like, this is how you consume information with a visual aid. And so there has been this this sort of race to the bottom, where people want just things so quickly, and the quality of things has been dispensed with, because that takes more time to deal with. You'll have to pay for artists who are capable of X, Y, and Z. And so this standardization that I'm attempting to explain has been properly identified by the power structure as something that just as a way of pumping out material at a very high rate, without having to contend with the challenges that come with creating things of more quality. At least what I'd argue. Yes, of course, that's a matter of opinion and subjectivity, but I think even now, even a Gen X person who likes to watch YouTube or Twitch streamers, they will notice this sort of ubiquitous art style and aesthetic style that is so again, the best words I can use for it, just it's so sanitized and so boring and kind of featureless, that it's just used as a way of pumping out uh, quantity rather than quality. And now with the people in charge in this power structure, they know. I mean, they may not even like any of the music that their businesses or their investors are throwing money at, but it just helps keep their power and influence and money flow secure for the time being. And there's no, there's vague goals. I think I've said this before in other podcasts and with Todd and Keith, but just as democracies have very short-term vague short-term goals, and very theoretical, nebulous long-term goals, this can easily be applied to those who run the entertainment industry, and those who are part of the upper tier of the artistic class. And that is, I guess there's probably a few things that explain that. I suppose that could be explained in part by capitalistic ideas of art and money making, and it could also be explained by the modern person's willingness, or I guess the impatience of modern people is what I would really just boil it down to. Is that people, because of the internet and smartphones and the ability to have food delivered to your door, and you've got the internet, people want things now. And I think that has a negative effect and creates a lacking criteria for what I think the three of us would roughly consider good art. And so I think that there's probably other reasons as well, but yeah, that's what I would I don't know. That's what I have to say in regards to how power, or those who are in charge or who run these industries that control art. I think I think that there's some explanatory weight there.
I think one thing to note with art sort of post-war is very much democratized, and I think that's partially why the elites want to look like they like common things like the Beatles and other things like that, because it means that they are of the people. Prior to, say, the Second War, especially the First World War, it was clearly much more aristocratic, and it was fine if you, well, what do you like, Verdi? In like the early 20th century, it's like, well, yeah, of course you are. Of course, that's what you say. You're an aristocrat. So I think that's a big part of it. That said, so I do think those popular things are popular with elites that they otherwise wouldn't be. But it's also true that in the narrative arts in particular, from the early 20th century onwards, there's actually a big sort of hewing, I don't remember the right term, segregation between high and low art, which previously didn't exist. I think comes from the sort of high artists who. What I'm thinking here primarily is those sorts of narrative art styles that basically get rid of narrative, because narrative is crass and lowbrow, and also those in the music world who've seen that melody is kitsch and boring, and so therefore we need to invent intellectually stimulating music like serialism. You get that move. So it's kind of a bit weird. You have people championing sort of, as it were, low art, but then also this sort of high art, which is even more inaccessible than opera. I don't think that's an unreasonable statement. I really don't think. I really think opera is significantly more accessible than serialism, or some of the sort of lacking in standard tonality music. I think that clearly obvious. With critics as well, though, I mean, they're kind of weird. I mean, back in the 70s, for instance, they poo-pooed Star Wars, but then they all got on the bandwagon to support, The Last Jedi in particular. But I think things are more overtly political now in the critical area, whereas they previously weren't. I mean, clearly they were always progressive in the main, and so they'd always support like feminist films and stuff like that. But it's so much more of a battleground now than it was historically, and it's gone particularly like that since, well, actually only relatively recently, probably the early 2010s. And so they have to sort of champion things for on side. I mean, clearly with the like the Fauci documentary, I mean, clearly that's artistically, well, I say this, I haven't seen it, but almost certainly is artistically worthless. But it's on the right side. So it's basically a piece of propaganda. As you pointed out, though, Tim, I mean, the Russian, some of the Russian, we mentioned Metropolis. Metropolis is a Fritz Lang film. It was German. What you may have been thinking, well, Metropolis is actually quite interesting, but the one that's most well regarded from the Russian films is a Sergei Eisenstein film, Battleship Potemkin, which did appear in Sight and Sound's top 10 films of all time for quite a long time, which is basically about, the glory of communist revolution. It's very innovative, I think, in its techniques. And I think this is one thing as well, which is interesting when it comes to great art. Sight and Sound, again, released their top 100 films of all time, but this time, again, following the 2012 one, with the most diverse people they could ask, with critics and everything. And some of them that are in the, yeah, so here we go. There's a Russian film, 1929, Man with the Movie Camera, which I haven't seen. But some of the really early ones like Nosferatu's probably. I don't think it ever got that high, but there's some things that are considered great not because they're actually that great, just because they're innovative and they were groundbreaking, which is true. So I think they're relevant in a historical sense. I just don't think they're necessarily that that artistically brilliant, even if they were sort of innovative and groundbreaking in using new techniques at the time. One other thing with the critics, one I used to listen to a film podcast for a long time with a guy called Mark Kermode, who's a well-known critic in the UK. One of the most interesting things that happened was on the podcast he had a debate with another film critic who was also quite an interesting guy called Robbie Collin as to whether or not the horror film Hereditary was good or not. Which is interesting because one of the few times you have a couple of critics actually arguing why something is good and why something is bad. Which I think is interesting because they seem to have sort of reasonable positions as to why it worked and why it didn't. Como was criticizing sort of its plot. It's too much on the nose explaining what's happening at the time, with the particular use of a doormat from memory. And I think Como is actually ultimately correct in there. But I do think it's interesting having two people who clearly know a lot about films, even though I think their critical judgments are not mine. They know a lot and can articulate why they think something good, why something is bad, which I think means that there is at least something there which is worthy of discussion or debate. It isn't merely subjective. Even though you might have some sort of subjective responses to it, there is sort of an object that's there. That was a bit scattered, but I think that answers a lot of the questions you posed.
My third question here will be the final one here is who decides what is good and what isn't? Hollywood executives, Harvard intellectuals, the New York Times, Oxford, Cambridge. I mean, you could, a cabal of Satanists and pedophile executives, Rotten Tomatoes, the Claremont Review of Books. That's, I think, Paul Gottfried's, Vice. I mean, I listed various, organizations which put out, which either create films or in turn criticize or praise and condone or and so forth various works of art, films, movies, books, etc. I mean, films are probably the dominant form of I don't think that's a controversial statement to make that the films are probably the dominant form of art today here in the sense of the popular as well as the elite domain here, as well as music too, popular music as well. So you have the sort of production function of music. What gets made, what doesn't get made here. There was only a certain amount of funds. You could go full Kevin Carson or go full Karl Marx or go full Sean Gabb here and just try to think otherwise here. But there is some level of scarcity here. Not everything's going to get made. So there is a question of what gets made. And then once it gets made, and then who or whom gets to decide what is good or isn't good. I'm always of two minds on an individual level here of whether I should read reviews of books or movies before I buy them. Now, if I'm buying a part for like a physical part, like a physical industrial good, like a bottom bracket or something like that, I read the reviews on Amazon. If I'm buying a pillow or I'm buying whatever, I read the reviews. I read the reviews on eBay and so forth. I think it's very good to read the reviews here. Yes, you do get paid reviews by the producer of the thing, but I think it's fairly reasonable. This is a good. This is a good. If the tool is primarily physical in nature, reading reviews is a good idea in this sense of what is and isn't a good thing here. There might, this is a good refrigerator. There doesn't necessarily maybe the aesthetics or something like that would be different here, but when it comes to movies, I'm always of two minds. Do I want to know what Rotten Tomatoes thinks of it? Because I could always counter signal because Rotten Tomatoes gave that an 86% rating. I think some of the Star Wars films also have similar ratings. And you think, well, am I just going to troll watch it, or so to speak? I'm not going to give it a chance. Well, again, I only have 35,000 days or so. So I don't. Let's go back to scarcity. I don't really want to watch it anyway. So in that sense, reviews can filter out. Because even though only a certain amount of things do get made, as I think TP was saying, a huge amount of production today, you do have to sort of somewhat filter out things. But there, for example, Paul Gottfried of Cotto and Gottfried recommended a film. I watched it. I didn't like it at all. Um, just as a thing, and I've one of the books by I think C.S. Lewis I was recommended to read. I didn't like it at all. I like some of C.S. Lewis's other stuff. And actually Orwell's. I really like Keep the Aphrodite to Flying. It's a book by Orwell. It's apparently the book that everyone hates by Orwell. I loved it. So it's so in this sense, I don't think you can escape reviews. And of course, there is a power structure at bay here. I can imagine an alternate universe where the Japanese and German Empire won either World War One or World War Two, and maybe the world's less democratic, maybe different things. I can imagine there's actually books and films about this very topic here. So I can imagine competing things being the case here. But I still think certain things in this sort of alternate world would still be roughly the same here. It seems like the communists liked a lot of like if you I think in Stalingrad there's an which is I forget what the name it is. Actually, it might still be called that. But there's a monument to the victory of the Soviet forces there. I think if you called up Plato, or you called up I don't know, some English aristocrat of the 1700s or French aristocrat, they would say, "Oh, this is a beautiful monument for war victory here," even though it was sort of, in a sense, same with the Moscow State University, which was, this is a beautiful looking building here. So, I think, and actually, speaking of good art, apparently Kyoto, a very famous city in Japan, was saved because some American guy in the 1920s went there and thought it was so beautiful. And they were making lists of firebombing and nuclear bombing. He said, "No, don't bomb them. That city's beautiful." And that's basically why we didn't burn that city down to the ground. So maybe that's the key to making good art. Make good art so good that your enemies don't want to destroy it in the name of collateral damage. So maybe that's the standard of good art here. But so who gets to decide here? Again, that's a very political question here. I don't think that's new here. So Keith Preston was saying, well, the culture wars are going to get exported. I think in a recent stream, whether culture wars will get exported to places like India and Japan, he's starting to see that sort of proto version happen. I think the culture wars have been happening since time immemorial. It's just that culture wars now are everyone participates because it's democracy in that sense. Whether actually everyone does have a right to participate, ability to participate, is a good question here. Which is not really the efforts here. But TP, I rambled on here. Here's my final question here, and for both of you, of course. Who gets to decide here? Like, that's the question. And then, and as far as the reviews and your own self, do you read reviews? I mean, I read product reviews, but film reviews, book reviews, it's a very thing. Like, are you just gonna like repeat what the reviewer says about the book? It's a very tough dilemma I see. TP?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, yeah, not to offer the most uninteresting answer possible, but I think when you ask, who decides what is good art and what isn't, rather than attributing it to oh, it's just the Hollywood executives, or it's just those damn academics, or it's just XYZ. It's the enlightened elders of the of Zion or something. Like I think the reality of it is that it's a very complex, bureaucratic collection of all of those, and also I would say it's also mass society's responses to these declarations of what is good art and what isn't to be part of the equation. You know, there's bands like oh heck, like Nickelback, or bands like that are just so easily digestible, and that have different slight different song styles that can appeal potentially to wider demographics, that mass society also, in sort of an abstract way, or maybe in a passive way, also decides what is good art and what isn't. um, I think Swithin said earlier that that there's forms of art that are, crass forms of art that are less accessible than, say, something like opera, and I believe that's the case 100% as well. Um, I think, as for myself, I've been a metal musician for 15 or 16 years now, and the reasons for why metal is such a underground, non-mainstream phenomenon is those reasons are pretty clear. I mean, first of all, the music is just very, very aggressive. The vocals are there's no singing. I mean, there's lots of metal genres now where there's lots of singing and it's very symphonic, or it can be very melodic. There's the band that's Blind Guardian, Demons and Wizards, Iced Earth, Iron Maiden, yada yada, those types of bands. That's not really the metal genre I'm speaking about. The kind I'm talking about is like Cannibal Corpse. And if anyone ever asks me, who's doesn't know anything about metal or has never listened to it or doesn't really care about it, and they want an example, I usually just tell them. I usually ask them if they've ever seen Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, and if they remember the scene where he walks into the club and the band is playing, and that band playing is actually Cannibal Corpse, and it's just very it's some of the guitar riffs and the music, they're difficult to discern right there on the spot, and of course the vocals are even less discernible, and it's the music is related to you know death and war and Satanism and evil and things like that, and so um, yeah, it's not lost on me why metal, or at least death metal, you could say, is so inaccessible, because it's inaccessible first of all on purpose. It's an extreme music genre that involves, or at least what I'd like to think involves, more. It requires a higher skill level of composition and individual instrument capability than, say, something like punk rock or reggae or things like that. And so um, I guess the accessibility variable here is what determines what is good art as well, because most people, and this is not some sort of nihilistic Nietzschean black pill, but many people are very simplistic, and that simplicity typically bleeds over into artistic preferences. And, I mean, if you were to travel the South in the 1920s, or maybe a little bit further, if you were to travel the South, the American South, in, say, the 1960s, and you were hoping to find, a Southerner, a man playing a banjo on his porch, what he thought of quote unquote Negro jazz, or things like that. He either had never heard of it, doesn't care to look into it. He's discovered what he likes, and the cement has sort of settled, and things are just sort of crystallized. And while there's nothing wrong with that per se, when that mentality or that simplicity is applied across populations of tens of millions of people, then that is going to create a response from the investor class. And if we are in some sort of alternate universe where the culture was completely different, and death metal was, took the place of pop, well, then the investor class would simply, adjust accordingly. And so but I think, if enough noise is made and enough disdain is made about bad pop music, or now there's like these hideous uh hybrids between country and rap, and that most of that has sort of fallen flat on its face, because it was sort of like this uh anti-artistic experiment that basically came from the investors of these different labels, and just are really looking to cash out on certain things, like take advantage of the strengths of these different genres, and then just slap them together in some type of hideous postmodern art piece sort of way. And so if there's enough rejection from society at large, then it'll die a horrible death. But if things are released which constantly get either a 51% approval rating from the public, figuratively speaking, then that will then that will simply endure, and then it might change slightly over time. But the last thing I'll say too is that when you listen to modern pop music, there are YouTube channels out there that they will take Michael Jackson songs or Huey Lewis and the News songs, or even like Lady Gaga songs or Lana Del Rey, and they'll take the songs and then they'll distill it down into a 16-bit format, so it sounds like it's being played out of a Super Nintendo. The reason why I'm saying this is that it's actually kind of fascinating to listen to music or these popular songs that way, because it at least reveals structurally what's going on. It's not that that's not accessible either, when you're listening to the original song itself. It's just that it's so structurally linear, like, and it's laid out in a linear way that you sort of throw your hands up. You're like, oh, I get why this is so damn popular, because it's verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, finish out with the chorus, repeat it twice, and and dust your hands off and ship it off to the factory and get it shrink wrapped and and get it into stores, or nowadays it's just it's Spotify or it's YouTube Music or iTunes or whatever. But it's kind of interesting to, I guess you could say, absorb music that way. And then, one last comment I'll say too is that you have, like, popular mass society of like what most people consider good music, and much of that is pop music. But then I think there's a whole, the internet has made it easier for people who have similar tastes in music that might be considered niche or inaccessible or avant-garde, if you don't mind the the pretentious nature of that label, or potentially pretentious nature of that label. But the internet makes it so that people can sort of hang out with each other and sort of stroke each other's ego, or just simply discuss why they like what they like. And I think that is, I think overall that's a good thing. The negative, the downside to that is that these people might be in a self-imposed echo chamber, to where they're simply people that will never, a lot of my metalhead buddies, they'll simply never be exposed to Felix Mendelssohn or Wagner or Tchaikovsky or Al Di Meola, or you name it. So but and that's okay. I think you can't expect the modern person to just, you can't expect their heart to grow as wide as the world and their curiosity simply go along with it. I think the three of us have a much higher curiosity and interest in lots of different types of music, but for the average person, for the Japanese businessman, or for the goat herder in Kazakhstan, I don't think we should really expect these people to just become citizens of the world and have Madonna lyrics memorized, and or be able to quote the same Marvel and Star Wars movies. So yeah, there you have it.
As to who decides what's good, I think if you have a sufficiently wide exposure to a particular area, I think basically anybody is competent to make a judgment. That's not to say that the judgments will all be good. But I think, for instance, I'm competent to give a decent review on film and TV because I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of things that have been suggested, the greatest films of all time, the greatest TV series, etc. I've seen them, and so I think I'm in a decent position to do that. I can do it with books, less so. Music, yeah, to some extent, depending on the genre. And a good example of this, actually, and other people in other domains recognize this, I'm quite interested in food. And the most well known food guide is the Michelin guide, the French one. And the top end restaurants, what they strive to do is to get a 3-star review. Because that basically confers on to you world-class status of one of the world's great restaurants. People will go on holiday just so that they can go to a 3-star restaurant. And what is interesting, I found I was looking at the differences between the Michelin Guide and there's also something called the AA, the Automotive Association, do some reviews here, and what the differences were between them. And I can't remember. It was a bit ambiguous what's the differences between them, but what's notable is the Michelin Guide refused to rate one incredibly expensive restaurant in London. It's like £310 a head, and all they do is sushi from this sushi master who worked in Japan and then came into London. They simply won't review it under the view that, well, we don't know if it's any good or not. We don't have sufficient encyclopedic knowledge of what one can do with sushi that we can give it a reasonable rating. And I'm like, well, yeah, I do the same. I don't think I could give a competent review. I can say if I like it or not, but whether or not it's a good sort of objective-ish review, I mean, you don't know the contours of the area well enough to be able to give a sufficient review. I mean, the same thing I would say with like painting. Can I really give am I competent to review painting? Not really. So I think there's people who are more or less competent. That's not to say that your view is necessarily wrong. I mean, just with exposure to different music styles, Roger Scruton said that he liked doing some, I don't know who he did them with, like art appreciation classes, music appreciation, sorry, and how they said, oh, like Lady Gaga. And basically the exercise was Scruton would play what he liked and explain why, and they play what they liked and explain why it was. And Scruton would sort of like point out how, structurally his was more complex or whatever. And now I don't know the results of this, whether they actually liking the stuff he liked more, but it was a way of sort of getting people to be attentive to what's there, because I think that's the case with mainstream music. It's quite simple because, well, the masses are quite simple. Now, I'm not trying to say that in a derogatory sense, but they just are. I mean, they're not hugely intellectually sophisticated. Ed Dutton did a video on like intelligent people like classical music. Well, it's more complicated, so it's more difficult to follow. And if you're not really up on that, you're not really going to get into it, which I think makes entire sense. So we're just going to have to recognize that there's certain things that are just not going to be hugely popular. But again, what I would say is, go back to my first point, is that I don't think it's a case that it's just purely subjective. There is something there that you can discuss over, in the same way you can say whether an argument is a good argument or not. I mean, the fact that people disagree on, for instance, whether the cosmological argument for the existence of God works doesn't necessarily mean that your view on that is entirely subjective. And I think this is where a lot of things with art go. Well, because people disagree, therefore it must be subjective, which they don't really apply anywhere else. But I would recognize that there's definitely more subjectivity in art than there is in other things. I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more people can get this material, and more people can, the higher we get in the search rankings. I'd also thank Term of Philosophy for appearing, because I forgot. But finally, if you would like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.